It's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Iain Walker from newDemocracy in Australia. They're actually one of the longer-running organizations in this field. Iain has been involved in setting up numerous citizen assemblies at different levels in Australia. I think the national level is still the one you do a lot of work trying to crack, but you've done a lot of experience. Iain has also been involved in a lot of projects outside of Australia. I showed you these OECD good practice principles. Iain was part of the expert group setting those up. You've worked for the UN Democracy Fund in numerous places, including, for example, in Fortaleza, Brazil. You helped set up one of the first assemblies there. You've done a lot of that work, and you've written a guide for the UN Democracy Fund with a number of other peoples, but you were one of the main authors. We will put that in the resource package. It's a really good guide, intro guide on setting up citizen assemblies. Iain, you will talk about one of the first things you need to think about is, what are you actually going to ask your citizens? Iain, the floor is yours. Can I ask Iain is Australian and is actually pretty good at speaking English, but I've heard sometimes he talks fast for non-native speakers. Just do like this. I can do it, but if you feel... also, when I'm talking too fast, just if speakers in general give us a little sign. Okay. Iain,
or a big sign. Don't be shy. Do this in a big way and I will slow down.
Okay. Iain, floor is yours.
Thank you, Yves. Good morning. This is your first practical session. Now, what I hope, if this goes super well, you're going to go away with 5 triggers that you go, I know a good remit. I know a great question when I see one. If this goes a bit average, I still hope you're going to take away just 2 words. 2 words. And they're going to be the words, what's hard? If you keep that in mind when thinking about a question, odds are you're going to come up with a good question. Now, this whole format today is structured around the principles you saw Yves set out in the first session, those columns or those pillars of principles. Now, remit's an interesting one because it also drags in the question of authority and it also drags in the question of time. When Yves sent me the brief for this session, it was actually a really hard thing to think about. Many of us have potted stories we talk about. And today I am going to anchor this in a story about the city of Melbourne. Because if you're thinking about remits, I can't talk for 30 minutes about one project and one 10-word question. I'm going to focus on one story for the city of Melbourne because it's actually in one story, a terrible remit which became a good one. It's an A/B test of showing the impact of different types of questions. Just to frame this, I wanted to just set out what makes a good project. I've got a sense from talking that there's a few people quite new to this. Well, firstly, facilitation. We can write beautiful project designs. Facilitation matters. That's why I loved one of the first questions that we got this morning. Facilitation matters. And that's why I think at Zakia's session at the end, pay double attention. Diversity and depth of information absolutely matters. If you get that right, if you give people a free expanse through the topic, you'll have a good project. Ditto recruitment. If you skew the room, it doesn't matter what you're doing. You can see all these things that you can get right, and it's all for nothing if you ask the wrong question. Because questions are the task that people are going to grip. Question is actually what's going to control how this group can function. And I mentioned time. Some of you will be going, I have this amazing question, but I only have 4 days. What have you got to do? You're going to have to match the question to fit the time. But let me start with a little story. City of Melbourne. So Melbourne's our second largest city in Australia, about 4 million people, but council areas are divided quite small, so it's a CBD region, just the core city centre. Picture a council with a budget of about $400 million a year. Now, through an election process, They'd experienced what happens in many election processes. Everyone had promised something expensive. Oh, we're going to replant an urban forest, replace every tree in the city. We're going to build cycleways. We're going to rebuild 2 village precincts so that they were suitable for urban dining. Can you see what's happening? It's getting expensive. We got a call from the city's chief financial officer, which is odd. Normally I would hear from engagement people or a mayor, but this time we heard from the CFO. He said, wow, this is interesting. Why are you calling me? He said, I'm a $400 million a year council. The promises that were made at the last election will see us overspent by $1.22 billion over the next 10 years. Now, I'm not going to get into discounted cash flow for a Thursday morning, I know what day it is. But you can start to see that's $120 million a year I've got to find. Now, if you're only earning $250 million from local taxes and you need to find $120 million, you have an awful problem. Do you want to, I don't know if I've got anyone in elected office in the room, but how do you feel about putting up local taxes 40%? No. How do you feel about walking away from your political promises? No. I said, oh, so what have you done so far? Now, for those, Eve put up an article from The Economist. And The Economist does a fabulous thing about listing the world's most livable cities. And unfortunately, Melbourne tends to come at the top of that list. I don't know how they're asking it. It just rains, it's awful, but they love that it comes on top of the list. They had attempted to do this format on their own. I said, that's fantastic. So what question are you asking people? And they said, well, it's not going well. We sent out 5,000 invitations and only 11 people responded. Well, that's terrible. So tell me the question. They said, how can we continue to excel in financial sustainability while remaining the world's most livable city? You all laugh, but that went through a lot of decision makers going, that is a question we want to ask people. That is not a question you want to ask people. What did we suggest instead? You've got a $1.22 billion overspend. You have a $400 million budget. We are citizens. How can we live within our means? What's in that question? Firstly, it's open. I'm not presupposing an increase in taxes, nor does it suggest a reduction in services. It simply presents the problem. That's all it is. It was a simple question, and what we wanted to show people was a problem that was resonant to their lives. When you think about all the principles, the tricky thing about workshops like this is that they interrelate. The question you ask will affect recruitment. The question you ask will affect facilitation and your ability to operate. And I just want to touch on these briefly. When you're doing recruitment, if you can get a 5 to 10% response rate, you are on track to run a very good project. If that response rate drops 1% and below, you're getting a skewed room. Where does the question fit into this? Our greatest enemy is the recycling bin. Because when that invitation lands, people go, oh, and throw it away. You're getting a skew. You need that question to connect for people as relevant to their lives. You need them to look at it and say, we should be fixing that. It's a very simple trigger to look at as you consider this. Why does it affect facilitation? You need to be able to operate a room where people find common ground and confront trade-offs. Now, you can't build, it's very difficult to build trade-offs directly into the question, but you can help the facilitator take the first 2 steps down that path. I read a lot of Citizens Assembly reports that come out. There's been an abundance of climate assemblies. And I want to test with you a recommendation I see that comes out a lot. We want electric buses and for them to be free. Sounds pretty good. A lot of laptops open here so you can test this out. What's an electric bus cost? You can shout out, it's fine. I've got 1 million here. It's not a bad guess. I'll take one more. On the button. Did you Google that? 600,000 euro from the bus procurement officer in the front row. You see the challenge on this? If someone goes, I want 2,000 buses that cost 600,000 each, that is a 1.2 billion euro spend. What's the challenge with this? Why are we doing citizens' assemblies and citizens' deliberation at all? Comes back to Eve's presentation. Why are we doing this? We're doing it to solve public problems. Done well, we're doing it to solve political barriers, to overcome the challenges of the political system. So where does our actual case study start? If I come back to City of Melbourne, I was asked to speak to a workshop of councillors. This is really where I want you to think. Our first project origination starts with having councillors and elected officials stipulate what problem they want us to solve. We get a couple of inquiries every week from people saying, I just love the method, I just want to try something. That never ends well. Do you know the projects that go really well? It's when someone comes to us and goes, I have a truly awful problem that I cannot solve any other way. In that, you have the seed of where you should be starting your remit conversation. This is counterintuitive. The best projects start with the hardest problem, not something that's easy. There is a temptation to go, oh, we've got 100 parks, let's let people decide whether they want swings or roundabouts. No, it's not going to work. Give us something awful. If you have a topic that is just a little bit feel-good, you're going to struggle to write a remit in the first place. So you can sit there torturing yourself thinking, how do I do it? And your problem is that you haven't grounded the topic in the first place. With the City of Melbourne, I got invited to speak to the councillors, 11 of them. We have quite small councils. And I can tell this story more candidly now because the mayor is no longer in office and didn't have a great period through the Me Too timing. I'm aware it's being recorded. He's out of office, so cheerio, Robert. In that format, there were all these reasons not to do a project. We were elected to make the decisions. It'll show that we don't have the answers. Yeah, that's going to be a hurdle for you. Why did it work? Why did the balance come through? Because a lot of people who've been in elected office, particularly if they've been in for 2 terms, actually want to have this conversation with you. So what did City of Melbourne teach us? And you will hear echoes of this, or arguably an amplification of this in the Irish case study tomorrow. Start with a hard problem. Now, I also want to share, we get this wrong as well. I can't do this presentation telling you a story and just talk about the City of Melbourne. That's one snapshot. I'm going to give you a little tour across a few other projects as well. Up on the board, you'll see City of Sydney 2050, which we operated in 2020. I've done 30 of these projects across 12 years. This was my Vietnam. I knew how to get into it. We didn't know how to get out of it. Why? Because we asked people about the city they wanted in 2050, a visioning project. I will caution you that this is a horrible topic to try to do because there's no hard problem in it. I'm echoing the same point, but showing that as a research foundation, we try to do new things. That project, if you look at the report, it looks better than it was because of time. Citizens are capable and they found what they needed to do. But from an objective point of view, if you think of the 2 examples I've just given, a city budgeting problem is at one extreme. There is a hard problem that citizens can understand and grip. And at the other end, there's an open visioning question which feels good, is extremely difficult to operate. Continuing in the storytelling, we got a call from the Chief of Staff for the South Australian Premier. One of those fun phone calls you get where they said, we're thinking about building a nuclear waste facility to take the entire world's nuclear waste and bury it on Indigenous land. Do you want to take this on? And of course, we exist to show that citizen deliberation can lead to trusted decisions. We ran this project in 2 parts. The remits are interesting. Because again, think about the problem. I'd said to the Premier's office, I think you have 2 problems. Your 2 problems are this. You've just spent $7 million over 18 months doing a royal commission, so an expert-led inquiry led by a judge. I'm not sure how common they are. They exist in different forms. We said, it's fantastic that you've done that. Now you've got 2 problems. No one will read it. And then when you do a series of engagement, 99% of the population thinks they know what you want to do anyway, and you're just doing the illusion of participation. What are the remits that we set around that for a project in 2 parts? Well, it was to solve those 2 hard problems. A first jury of 50 people was given 1 task. It was to write the government's collateral around this. What do all South Australians need to know about the Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission? Take a 318-page, highly technical report and distill it into what they'd learned. Think about the incentives for people. No one would naturally read this report. It's not super interesting. But if I tell you you're one of 50 people, you will get an audience with the Premier. And what you self-write yourselves will be distributed. It becomes compelling. What did the remit do? It focused them on the hardest part of the problem, that no one would read it. Now, the other reason I've used this as an example, the state went out and did mass engagement. People got angrier and angrier through this phase. And then we brought people back for a second jury at the end. And it had one of the most controversial questions that we've put. Something where we're still learning from how this question could have been phrased better. But it's better that you learn from our experience and step up from that than try to start from scratch. We asked people, under what circumstances, if any, should this proposal proceed? So, plain English question. People understood it. But controversial. Why? We'd phrased a question that we thought was open because it included, if any, is to go, no, throw it away. We don't want this. That's not how it landed. It was seen as a question with a leaning. We still don't know how that could have been phrased better, but what it really reinforced is the entire population needs to look at your question and go, that's fair enough. Some years later, I actually was I was at an event where a series of groups who, because of the camera, I'm not going to name, but they were sitting around discussing how this question was formulated. Some quite senior people you would see in the news, were discussing how they had considerable insight, how this question had been formulated with the Premier's office and the Nuclear Waste Agency, how it had been constructed and how it had been tested. I let the conversation go on for 10 minutes or so and just said, I have one small comment to make. I wrote the question. This can get a life of its own. One lesson I would always offer people in elected office, they will have a strong desire to hold the pen. They will be itching to write the questions themselves. And you say to them, this is controversial. You've got 2 scenarios. Defending why you wrote it that way, or pointing at me and saying, he did it. The latter scenario is far more preferable. The last case study I wanted to touch on was this one on urban planning. Because the question was a little indirect, but it was simple and people understood it. Sometimes you've got to give people context. You've got to give them that starting point. We often say, what's my criteria for a question? It's 10 words and you get it immediately. And I'm going to step through this in a second. Now, with urban planning projects are the hardest projects that you have to operate because they touch on every portfolio area. You can't do urban planning without thinking about education and transport and housing affordability and social impacts. They're very complex to operate. Not a place to start is probably a health warning that comes with that. We simply said, a framing sentence. Canberra is growing at a rate of 8% per year, and our urban plan has never changed. We asked them a question, what is the city we want? What did we need them to do was confront a trade-off effectively between density, go up, or go out. The question served its purpose well, and yet by some triggers is a little bit vague. What is the city we want? Isn't that a visioning question? It's because you can use a framing sentence at the outset. So sometimes as you step through this and you take it away, what's hard is give people one line of context. Still really plain language. You've got to be able to instantly get it. Well, stories are nice, but now I'm going to step to the piece that I hope you'll take away. What are the 5 lessons common to all these examples, including where the example didn't go well? At the risk of being repetitive, but I won't fight this, focused on the hardest part of the decision. Every single time, I want you to ask that question, what's hard? It's a question I will lead off with in every single engagement with elected decision makers. Don't talk around the issue. Don't talk in political phrases. Tell me why it's awful. I was doing some briefings in the federal parliament recently for an opposition party. I'm not going to name the politician. They wouldn't actually mind, but you don't want them popping up on a video thinking these conversations go everywhere. And they were learning about citizens' assemblies for the first time. And I said, now I want you to think about what's hard. And this particular very senior politician said, I know what's hard. We have a national disability insurance scheme, which essentially means that people with a profound disability get a benefit of around $100,000 a year for housing, lifestyle. So a program that's much more generous than the regular pension. And he said to me, when this was established, no one set the rules particularly well. And technically, over 10% of the population could be eligible. It's unaffordable. Do you know why this is hard? Because no one in politics wants to be the person who trims that program. This is a great starting point for a project. Who should be eligible for our National Disability Fund? It's instantly understandable. People can instantly see from the news this is a program that is getting progressively more expensive over time. You don't need to soften it, etc. You're trying to come to the blunt, sharpest part of the problem. You don't need to get into the edge cases. You're trying to get people to confront a trade-off of we have $30 billion and a population. Who gets the money? Who doesn't? Pointing them at that hard part of the problem. Second principle, jurisdictional authority. I tried to find a simpler way to say this and I couldn't do it. You need to match that the level of government who is retaining you can actually solve for the answers they get, and then frame the question to that. We have a current piece of federal government advocacy around what anyone in Australia would say is in our top 2 hardest problems, housing affordability. Housing has got really expensive in Australia. Now, this is an awful project to take on because federal, state and local government all have responsibility. Federal government has the big bucket of money. State government controls all the planning and zoning. Local government approves buildings. How can you operate a project? We're framing the question, what can the federal government do to improve housing affordability? Question that connects for the population. One that is tied to the jurisdiction. So explicitly, if you go, it's all a council's problem, I can't attack and address that. So think about the jurisdiction. One of the most challenging things in the very popular climate assemblies is you have local councils running things and then a jury or an assembly that will respond with things that relate to federal taxes or things that are outside the jurisdiction. A sharper question will focus people on that. And to give you a sense, and I can only talk from an Australian context, okay, on a climate topic, what can my council control? What you build things out of? Where you site renewable energy. You probably want to focus on one problem. There's a great trade-off in that. We can build out of timber, which is embedded carbon, or we can build out of concrete, which is a third the price. There is a wonderful, politically difficult trade-off in that. So focus your question on the jurisdiction. Number 3 is my shorthand way of focusing on keeping the question simple and understandable and beating the recycling bin. I say to my team, if you can't mention the question to the person who's paying half attention in conversation to you, making your coffee in the morning, the question doesn't work. So we will, as we draft a project design, we'll head down to order a morning coffee, and they say, oh, what are you working on? And we drop the question into conversation. And if you don't immediately get someone going, yeah, someone should work on that, the question doesn't work. It is the simplest test you can take away. So the barista test is a very simple thing to keep in mind. It stops you becoming wordy and convoluted. Fourth is a technical point, and bluntly, why there is a degree of expertise in framing these questions. Frame an open question. The nature of politics is often binary closed questions, because there's good guys and bad guys, there's my side and their side. This is not, do we want to support welfare or be mean to people? These kind of briefs actually come up. A question might be, what is a fair level of welfare? It's an open question. It could be higher, it could be lower, but it's open. No, yes. If you look at your question, it can be a yes or a no. You've got a problem. Lastly, and it's a version of number 3, but I want you to test this. If your parents and friends receive this invitation and it has the question on it, do they throw it out? This is our recruitment test. Are we writing a question that's going to impair recruitment? It's kind of close to number 3, but it's so important that we apply this double test. So that's what I hope you've taken away today. A remit is going to influence a number of other variables. A good question is what facilitators will rely on and have up on screen in big letters every hour, because you're going to point people and say, you're solving this problem. A good question is scoped to the time that you have available, so it's not so expansive. Good question is going to help your recruitment. A good question will focus active stakeholders and special interests who are providing that diversity of sources of information, and it will focus them on the precise question that needs to be answered, and you will get information that's on topic. So the question matters. Ask for help. There's a community of people who want to help you out. With that, I really hope you've taken away these 5 points. If I lost you somewhere along the way, the one trigger to always ask yourself if you look at it is, what's hard? Thanks for that.